Welcome to Critical Thinking Deductive Arguments. This video covers material based on a workbook for arguments, 3rd edition by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. Now we're going to cover Rule 27, which is a special rule for deductive arguments called Reductio ad Absurdum. Reductio ad Absurdum is also known as indirect proof. So this is a type of deductive argument where you're proving the conclusion indirectly. You start by assuming the opposite of what you want to prove, and then you show it leads to a contradiction, showing that the assumption must be false. So let's look at the logical form of arguments that are reductios. If you want to prove a proposition P, then you would actually start by assuming not P. And then the second step is to show that some implication that we can call Q follows from not P. Now, indirect proof or reductio ad absurdum is going to be flexible as to how you derive the implication from the assumption. So different versions of the argument are going to have a different number of premises. So you could think of 1 and 2 as having an indefinite number of premises or lines of the argument between them. It will vary based on the case how many lines it takes to prove Q follows from not P. And also you'd be using other logical rules to do that. And then in order for the rule to work, you have to show that the implication Q leads to a contradiction. So Q is going to contradict not Q, which you've already assumed, or which you can derive from your other premises. So Q is always going to be something derived in part from not P, and typically from other assumptions as well. And then you're going to know either from your initial assumptions that not Q must be true, or perhaps you can derive not Q from another initial assumption that's given to you in the proof. Once you have that contradiction Q and not Q, then you can prove that the original assumption not P is false. So P must be true all along. The basic concept behind the reductio is that if something leads to a contradiction, then that assumption must be false. So you prove it leads to a contradiction, we can conclude the original assumption must be false, and so we get to our intended conclusion. Let's look at a sample problem that illustrates how you would do this. Now, if you're using this concept in a formal logic class, you would be constructing more formalized proofs or natural deduction proofs, where every step of the proof is numbered and you use logical symbols. But the workbook for arguments is just providing you an introduction to the rules of critical thinking. So you get a little bit of formal logic or symbolic logic, but not the whole shebang. So that's why some of this is going to be kind of variable and loose. When you answer these types of problems, it's enough just to indicate what the assumption is of the reductio, what the implication is, what that contradicts, and then what the main conclusion is supposed to be. And it's going to vary from argument to argument, how many steps between the assumption and the implication. So let's look at this example. This is an adaptation, a kind of rewriting in simpler form of an argument by David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, famous skeptic and atheist. The book he wrote is called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. This was actually published after his death because some of the arguments were considered so controversial. Even though Hume never publicly avowed atheism, a lot of the arguments he gave, both in this and in the works published in his life, struck many people as being critical of religion, and so he had the reputation of an atheist, and he probably was one as well. So he was one of the first philosophers to argue directly against the existence of God, at least in Western philosophy. Suppose the world has a creator like a house does. Now, when houses are not perfect, we know who to blame, the carpenters and masons who made them. But the world is not wholly perfect. Therefore, it would seem to follow that the creator of the world is not perfect either. But you would consider this conclusion absurd. The only way to avoid the absurdity, however, is to reject the supposition that leads to it. Therefore, the world does not have a creator in the way a house does. So in order to identify the parts of this reductio, we can start with the conclusion. This is a good strategy in general when you're trying to analyze an argument, figure out what the main conclusion of the argument is supposed to be. So in this case, the main conclusion is the last sentence in the argument. Therefore, the world does not have a creator in the way a house does. You'll notice there's also a therefore higher up in the argument. This can happen because with the reductio ad absurdum, we're going to have more than one logical inference, more than one logical move. So there's going to be a sub-conclusion that leads to the implication before you get to the main conclusion. One of the clues that this is the main conclusion at the end is just the fact that it is at the end. Also, if you read the whole argument, it just makes sense to regard the last sentence as the main conclusion. And generally with the reductio, you will have the main conclusion after the implication and the contradiction. It may also occur at the very beginning of the argument where you're trying to prove that the world does not have a creator, and then you could say, well, suppose it does. So that leads to the next step, which is to identify what assumption starts out the reductio. And the indicator words for assumptions are suppose that, let's assume that, things like that. Suppose the world has a creator like a house does. So it's not saying that the proposition the world has a creator like a house does, it's true. It's implying that we're just assuming it for the sake of argument. So the reductio is where you literally just assume that for the sake of the reductio or indirect proof. It's not that you actually are trying to argue for that or claim that it's actually true. The next step is to identify what implication is supposed to follow from the assumption. You can see we have another therefore in the middle of the argument. Therefore, it would seem to follow that the creator of the world is not perfect either. So therefore is usually a conclusion indicator, and it is functioning that way in this case, but it's actually a conclusion that's not the main conclusion of the argument. The word implication is suggesting that this proposition is implied by the initial assumption. So you can prove it, you can make an argument for that implication. So this could be the end of an argument. It would seem to follow that the creator of the world is not perfect. But in this case, in the reductio, we're doing another logical step to show that that implication leads to a contradiction. You'll notice there's a couple of lines between the assumption and the implication. Now, when houses are not perfect, we know who to blame, the carpenters and masons who made them. But the world is not wholly perfect. So those two sentences, those two propositions have to be in there to make the implication logically follow from the assumption. The basic idea of the argument is an argument by analogy. When houses are not perfect, we know who to blame, carpenters and masons who made them. The world is not wholly perfect. Therefore, by analogy, the creator of the world is not perfect either. So the last thing to identify is the contradiction. What is this implication supposed to be contradicting? So we can identify the sentence where the contradiction is flagged. You would consider this conclusion absurd. In this case, the argument doesn't explain in detail what the contradiction is, but it's easy to fill in the gaps. If the implication is that the creator of the world is not perfect, that's going to conflict with most people who believe in God, most theists. They do believe in a perfect or all good God. And so that's the belief that is yielding this contradiction. The conclusion or that initial implication is absurd because it contradicts the widely shared or nearly universal belief among theists that God is completely perfect. So that's basically how you identify the main parts of a reductio argument. Keep in mind that it's going to be flexible, how many propositions are between the assumption and the implication. And sometimes there might be additional propositions as well, showing that the implication contradicts with some other fact or some other premise.